The rain fell in heavy sheets across the city streets, turning the evening into a silver curtain of water. Marcus Wellington pulled his black sedan into the circular driveway of his mansion, the headlights cutting through the darkness like pale swords. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm against the storm, and he could barely make out the familiar outline of his home through the downpour. It had been another long day at the office. Another day of board meetings, profit margins, and endless phone calls that stretched well into the night. Marcus was tired in a way that sleep couldn't cure. At 45, he had everything money could buy, yet something always felt missing from his perfectly ordered life. As he reached for the car door handle, movement caught his eye near the iron gates of his property. Through the rain-blurred passenger window, he saw two figures huddled together on the sidewalk. They were sitting on the cold concrete, pressed against his stone wall, trying to find shelter under the small overhang of his mailbox. Marcus paused, his hand still on the door handle. In this wealthy neighborhood, it was unusual to see anyone walking, let alone sitting outside in weather like this. He squinted through the glass, trying to get a better look. The figures were an elderly couple. The woman's gray hair was plastered to her head by the rain, and she was shivering visibly even from this distance. The man beside her had his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, but Marcus could see that he was struggling too. Their clothes were soaked through and they looked exhausted. For a moment, Marcus sat frozen in his car. His first instinct was to drive into his garage and pretend he hadn't seen them. He could call the police, he reasoned. Let someone else handle it. That's what he usually did when faced with problems that money couldn't solve with a simple phone call. But something about the way the old man held his wife stopped Marcus cold. There was such tenderness in that simple gesture, such devotion, even in their obvious distress. It reminded him of something he had lost long ago, something he had traded away in his pursuit of success. Marcus turned off the engine and stepped out into the rain. The cold water immediately soaked through his expensive suit, but he barely noticed. He walked slowly toward the couple, his footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. As he got closer, he could see them more clearly. The woman was probably in her 70s, with kind eyes that looked up at him with a mixture of hope and fear. The man was about the same age, his weathered hands still protective around his wife despite his own obvious discomfort. "Excuse me," Marcus said gently, raising his voice to be heard over the rain. "Are you both all right?" The old man looked up, his eyes wary but not unfriendly. "We're fine, sir. Just waiting for the rain to ease up a bit." But Marcus could see they were far from fine. The woman was shaking badly, and both of them looked like they hadn't eaten in quite some time. Their clothes, while clean, were worn thin and offered little protection against the storm. "I'm Marcus," he said, crouching down to their level. "This is my house. Would you like to come inside and dry off?" The couple exchanged glances. The woman's eyes lit up with gratitude, but the man shook his head firmly. "That's very kind of you, but we don't want to be any trouble." "You wouldn't be any trouble at all," Marcus insisted. "Please, at least until the storm passes." After another long moment, the man nodded slowly. "Just until it stops raining," he said. "I'm Harold, and this is my wife, Dorothy." Marcus helped them both to their feet, noting how frail they felt under his hands. He led them up the winding path to his front door, all three of them getting thoroughly soaked in the process. Inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them immediately. Marcus showed Harold and Dorothy to the living room, where a gas fireplace provided both heat and soft, dancing light. He brought them thick towels and dry clothes, then busied himself in the kitchen making hot tea and sandwiches. As he worked, Marcus found himself listening to their quiet conversation from the next room. They spoke in the gentle way that couples do after decades together, full of shared understanding and small kindnesses. Dorothy worried that Harold's arthritis was acting up in the damp weather. Harold fretted that Dorothy hadn't eaten enough that day. When Marcus returned with the food, he learned their story in pieces. Harold had worked for 30 years as a maintenance supervisor at a local factory. Dorothy had been a seamstress. They had saved carefully for retirement, but Harold's medical bills after a heart attack had wiped out most of their savings. Their small apartment rent had gone up again, and they simply couldn't afford it anymore. "We've been staying in our car," Harold explained, his voice heavy with embarrassment. "But it broke down this morning. We were walking to the shelter when the rain started." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. Here were two people who had worked their whole lives, who clearly loved each other deeply, reduced to seeking shelter under his mailbox. Meanwhile, he lived alone in a house with 12 rooms, most of which he never used. The rain continued to fall outside, but none of them seemed to notice anymore. They talked late into the evening. Harold told stories about his work, and Dorothy showed Marcus pictures of their grandchildren, whom they rarely got to see anymore. Marcus found himself sharing things he hadn't talked about in years. His childhood, his dreams before success became his only goal, his loneliness. When morning came, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting everything golden. Harold and Dorothy prepared to leave, thanking Marcus repeatedly for his kindness. But Marcus had made a decision sometime during the night, listening to their gentle voices and remembering what it felt like to care about something more than profit margins. "I have a proposition," he said as they gathered their few belongings. "I have a guest house in the back that's been empty for years. It has its own kitchen, bathroom, everything you'd need. What if you stayed there, and in exchange, Harold, you could help me maintain this place? It's getting too big for me to manage alone." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. Harold stood straighter than he had since Marcus first saw them. "Are you sure?" Harold asked, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus nodded, surprising himself with how sure he felt. "I think we could help each other." As they shook hands, Marcus realized something had shifted in his perfectly ordered world. For the first time in years, his house would truly be a home. And sometimes, the best investments aren't measured in dollars at all.